Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was an evening as quiet and unassuming as any other I had spent at 221B Baker Street. The faint breeze from the spring air rattled the windows ever so gently, and the faint smell of tobacco from Holmes's pipe mixed with the musty scent of old books that adorned our rooms. A typical evening of repose, one which, as it happened, would soon be shattered. As I sat by the fire, my thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the recent cases that had passed through our hands. All had been brought to a satisfactory close, as Holmes's keen mind and methodical deductions always found the heart of the matter. Yet for all the apparent calm, I could not shake the feeling that we were on the precipice of something new, something that would draw us back into the murky depths of intrigue. It was then, amidst this quietude, that I heard the unmistakable sound of a firm knock on our door. At that moment, I could not have known the chain of events this visitor would set into motion, nor the dark mysteries that were soon to unravel before us. The door swung open, revealing a figure whom I recognized immediately, Inspector Tobias Rudge, a man of middle age and a long acquaintance of Sherlock Holmes. He was not one to call on us unannounced, and his arrival now, in the late hours of the evening, carried an unmistakable air of urgency. His face, usually so composed, was marked by the unmistakable signs of distress, his brow furrowed and his eyes wide with a concern I had rarely seen in him. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped into the room, removing his coat with a mechanical motion. His presence seemed to darken the room, as if the weight of the matter on his mind had cast a shadow over the very walls of Baker Street. "Holmes," he began, turning his gaze towards my companion, "I require your assistance with a matter that concerns not only the law but a man's very reputation." Holmes, without taking his eyes off the newspaper he had been perusing, raised an eyebrow. "Indeed, Rudge. Do sit down. You appear to have something troubling you." It was not in Rudge's nature to seek help unless absolutely necessary, and I knew then that whatever he was about to say, it would not be a case like any other we had faced. The inspector settled into the armchair across from us, his hands clasped tightly together as though the very air in the room was too thin for him to breathe. "Constable Alfred Miles," Rudge began, his voice low and tinged with disbelief, "is a man of spotless record, one of the most dependable officers in our ranks. Yet last night, he was discovered unconscious beside a warehouse in the East End, a warehouse that had been ransacked and stripped of its contents, valuable government documents among them." I leaned forward, intrigued. Holmes, too, gave a slight nod, his interest piqued. "Unconscious?" Holmes echoed, his voice carrying a tone of quiet amusement. "And the cause of his state?" "That's where the mystery lies," Rudge replied. "Miles insists that he was struck from behind. He remembers nothing of the incident, save for a strange sound. A whistle, he claims, before he lost consciousness. Yet there is no sign of struggle, no evidence to suggest he was attacked. And yet, the documents are gone." I could hear the frustration in Rudge's voice as he continued. "We're left with two possibilities. Either Miles has fallen victim to a cunning ruse, or he has betrayed us, and his own negligence has cost us dearly." Holmes sat still, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the information. So a trusted officer found unconscious, with government property vanished under his watch. Holmes murmured, as if weighing the notion. Tell me, Inspector, has anything in Miles's history ever hinted at such a lapse? Rudge's hesitation was all the answer Holmes needed. I see, Holmes said softly. This is no ordinary case. He stood then, his eyes gleaming with a flicker of that familiar intensity. I shall need the details of the scene, Rudge. I believe, however, we shall find that things are not as they first appear. Rudge, though shaken, seemed relieved at Holmes's response. I knew you would be the one to see through this, Holmes. Miles, he was on the verge of becoming an exemplary officer. To see him fall so utterly would be a tragedy for the force. Holmes gave a slight smile, a faint trace of cynicism in his expression. We shall see, my dear Rudge. The human mind is a complicated thing, rarely simple in its motivations. What we have before us is not a mere lapse in judgment, but a carefully constructed puzzle. And if there is one thing I excel at, it is in fitting together the pieces. I stood to join Holmes as he prepared to depart. You have our full attention, Holmes, I said, and watched as he reached for his coat. The game is afoot, Watson, Holmes remarked, his gaze distant, as he seemed already lost in thought, unravelling the mystery in his mind. We shall proceed to the scene immediately, where I shall begin the hunt for the hidden clues. The truth, as always, will be waiting to be discovered. Certainly. Below is the fully immersive script for Section 2. The investigation begins, based on the provided subheadings, written in the authentic voice of Dr. Watson, matching the tone, flow, and structure of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's original Sherlock Holmes stories. The morning that followed our conversation with Inspector Rudge was one of those peculiar London mornings in which the fog clings low to the ground, as though reluctant to release its grip upon the cobbled streets. Holmes, as ever, displayed no discomfort in the chill that settled over our shoulders, nor in the grim surroundings that greeted us as we emerged from the cab in the East End. Our destination stood between two narrow alleyways, buildings huddled like conspirators on either side, their soot-streaked walls casting long, crooked shadows. Holmes led the way with purpose, his eyes sharp, yet expression unreadable, as though the entire scene had already been reconstructed within the chambers of his mind. You observe the silence, Watson, he remarked as we approached the constabulary post. A city of millions, and yet in this corner of it, not even a stray cart disturbs the air. That, in itself, is most instructive. I made no reply, save for a nod, for I had learned by now that such observations were best left to ferment within his mind. We were soon met by a young officer who, having received word from Inspector Rudge, granted us access to the scene of the incident. Holmes did not wait for ceremony. With the briskness of a man possessed by a singular focus, he made for the warehouse in question, a brick structure with a rusted lock hanging from the gate. It is here, Watson, Holmes murmured. Let us see if the building is as silent in its evidence as the streets around it. Inside the warehouse, all was gloom. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by the faint beam of morning light slipping through a cracked window pane. Holmes crouched low, examining the floor with the care of a surgeon at his table. Observe, Watson, he said, pointing to a faint indentation on the dusty floorboards. Footprints, unshod, or rather, shod, with rubber-soled footwear, I would venture. Note the separation between the heel and toe impressions. This is not the gait of a labourer, but of a man accustomed to stealth. I peered closer and saw, indeed, the light outlines that had escaped my notice entirely. A few paces on, Holmes straightened suddenly. Here, A wax trail, faint but present. He scraped a residue from the floor and placed it in a small vial from his coat pocket. Sealing wax, I offered, somewhat uncertainly. Precisely, but not of the standard sort. This is a police-grade red wax used for evidence documentation and official stamps. And now, what is conspicuously absent? I looked around, bewildered. I confess, I see only disarray, Holmes. He moved swiftly toward the door. The keyring, Watson. According to Rudge, Miles had secured the premises with a fresh set of keys. Yet, no such ring has been located upon his person, nor in the surrounding vicinity. That, too, is telling. Just then, Holmes bent to inspect the edge of the doorframe. A splinter, fresh, and a faint mark of metal scored across the lock plate. Someone removed that lock post incident, and not with a key. He stood again, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes gleaming. We are not merely dealing with a theft, my friend. We are in the presence of something calculated, almost theatrical in its staging. Let us speak now to those who last stood watch over this place. The warehouse supervisor, a wiry man with thinning hair and a perpetually damp brow, was brought before us in a nearby office. He introduced himself as Mr. Otto Kellerman, and his manner was that of a man who hoped politeness might serve in place of answers. Holmes allowed the man to speak first, a silence which Kellerman attempted to fill with hurried explanations. I was not present at the time of the incident, sir, he said, eyes darting nervously. Had the evening off, I did. Came back next morning to find the place crawling with constables. You were unaware then of the nature of the material stored here, Holmes inquired with casual indifference. Strictly shipping records and old manifests, sir. Nothing of particular value, leastways, not that I knew of. Holmes's eyes sharpened at that. Interesting. And yet you have been in the employ of the company for how long? 8 years, Mr. Holmes. In 8 years, did you never question why a warehouse of such limited importance merited government oversight, routine constable patrols, and reinforced locks on every door? Kellerman opened his mouth, then closed it again. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. Holmes leaned forward slightly. You are, I presume, aware that any falsehood given in the course of a criminal investigation places you in jeopardy of prosecution. Kellerman swallowed. I don't know anything about any documents, sir. I just manage the building. I do what I'm told. Holmes made no further accusation. Instead, he rose and thanked the man with a cordial nod. Once Kellerman had departed, Holmes turned to me. An evasive man, Watson, and not an especially skilled one. He knows more than he dares admit, and I dare say he is more fearful of someone else than of us. That is always an encouraging sign. Constable Alfred Miles lay propped against a stiff white pillow in the corner cot of the East End Station infirmary. Though alert, his complexion bore the pallor of a man who had endured both physical discomfort and psychological shock. His eyes, dark-rimmed and unsteady, flicked between Holmes and myself as we approached his bedside. I swear it, sir, he said weakly, clutching the wool blanket tighter about him. I was not asleep. I would never abandon my post, not I. Calm yourself, Mr. Miles, Holmes said gently, his tone more tempered than usual. We are not here to accuse, but to listen. I require nothing more from you than the truth. Miles exhaled shakily. I was patrolling the east end of the warehouse as assigned. It was nearing 2 o'clock, I believe, when I heard... He paused, frowning as though the recollection were just out of reach. A tune. A man whistling. A strange one. Soft. Lilting, but unfamiliar. It echoed oddly in the alleyway. That's the last thing I remember. You saw no figure? Holmes inquired. None. The whistle seemed to come from behind the storage crates near the loading dock. I stepped toward it, thinking perhaps one of the lads was jesting. But then, darkness. Nothing else. Holmes nodded, folding his hands behind his back. You awoke in the infirmary. I came to as they were carrying me. Rudge told me of the theft. I can scarce believe it. Holmes's gaze lingered on the man a moment longer, then turned to me. A whistled tune, an uncommon detail, unlikely to be imagined. No, Watson, this man is not a liar nor a fool. His confusion is genuine. I found myself inclined to agree. There was a tremble in Miles's voice that could not be feigned. Whatever had occurred that night, it had not been the doing of a man asleep at his post. As Holmes examined the personal effects that had been returned to Miles, I observed him with a kind of reverence born of familiarity. He lifted each item, belt, gloves, nightstick, with the delicacy of a jeweller inspecting rare gems. It was not long before his attention settled on the man's boots. These are standard issue, he murmured, turning one over in his gloved hands. But look here, Watson. The sole bears a scrape at the arch, not at the toe or heel. And here, along the stitching, mild separation, consistent with sudden torque, as one might incur if the leg were twisted unexpectedly. Would you not agree? I peered closer. Yes, certainly, but what does it suggest? Holmes looked up, eyes gleaming. It suggests that the good constable fell in a manner inconsistent with fainting or sleep. He was wrenched off his feet, forcefully and with precision. We moved on to the overcoat Miles had been wearing that night. Holmes leaned closer, then drew back with a look of curiosity. Do you detect it, Watson? He asked. I leaned in, inhaling the fabric. A faint yet unmistakable scent lingered there. Something floral? Medicinal, perhaps? Precisely. Laudanum, I suspect, but altered, not in its natural form. Holmes reached into his coat for a small glass vial and brushed the fabric gently, sealing the sample. There is something unnatural in its composition, something that may explain the constable's swift descent into unconsciousness. I glanced again at Miles, who rested now in a light sleep. A flush of anger rose within me at the thought that he had been rendered helpless by some concealed agent. Then, as Holmes straightened, I noticed it too. Deep, dark bruising just beneath the man's collarbone. Holmes, I said quietly, look here. He did, and nodded grimly. Blunt force, but delivered from above. Yes, Watson, he was attacked. Of that, I am now certain. Our final inquiry for the morning brought us face to face with Sergeant Horace Larch, a broad-shouldered man with bristling moustaches and the firm countenance of one who fancied himself both incorruptible and indispensable. He greeted us with curt professionalism, but there was something in the tightness of his jaw and the narrowness of his gaze that set me on edge at once. You've come about Miles, I expect, he said, folding his arms. A sad business, but the force cannot afford to carry dead weight. Holmes regarded him coolly. Do you hold your fellow officer in such low regard, Sergeant? Larch sniffed. I hold him in exactly the regard he has earned. Always too eager, too trusting. No doubt he thought he could handle something above his station. Some men learn discipline the hard way. Holmes raised an eyebrow. A curious stance for a man in your position. You seem almost pleased. At that, Larch's composure wavered for but a moment. I speak plainly, Mr. Holmes. That is all. Holmes made no reply, merely nodding with polite detachment. But as we took our leave of the sergeant, I noticed that Holmes lingered at the doorway a fraction longer than necessary, his eyes still fixed on Larch. Outside, he spoke softly. Mark him well, Watson. There is something within that man which does not sit easily with me. Jealousy? I ventured. Or fear, Holmes replied. and both can be equally dangerous. We returned that afternoon to Baker Street, where Holmes, in his usual fashion, buried himself in a stack of police registries, internal reports, and private correspondences. He requested no assistance from me and offered no commentary, save for the occasional grunt of recognition or a low, mirthless chuckle that signified the unearthing of something disagreeable. By early evening, he rose from his chair and placed a hand upon the fireplace mantel, staring into the empty grate as though the ashes themselves might whisper revelations. "Well, Watson," he said finally, "it would appear our Sergeant Larch is not the pillar of rectitude he so affects to be." I looked up with interest. "You found something?" "A handful of somethings," he replied, selecting a sheaf of papers from the table. "Here are 5 separate complaints, each buried discreetly, each dismissed as insubstantial. And yet, taken together, they paint a troubling portrait." He held up a page. "Brutality towards a young constable under his supervision, a report of missing evidence in a narcotics seizure, a confidential memo suggesting Larch frequents a certain gambling establishment notorious for its ties to the East End underworld. All this, Watson, and still he has managed to rise unhindered through the ranks." "But surely," I began, "if these matters were raised formally—" "They were silenced, Watson, or if not silenced, drowned in the bureaucracy of internal inquiry. Larch is protected, or feared. That distinction will become important." I felt a chill that was not due to the late March air. "Do you believe he is central to the case?" "I believe," said Holmes with an edge of steel in his voice, "that we are dealing not merely with a rogue officer, but with a man whose loyalties have long ceased to lie with the law he purports to uphold. And if he is involved in the theft from the warehouse, he is no solitary player." He turned back toward the table. "The threads are drawing closer, Watson, and I suspect they will soon tighten." No more than an hour later, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the sitting-room door bearing a telegram. She handed it to Holmes with a look of mild apprehension, for she had by now developed a sixth sense for messages that foretold danger. Holmes opened it, scanned its contents once, and then again. His eyes narrowed. "Curious," he murmured. I leaned forward. "From whom?" "There is no sender listed," he replied. "The telegram was handed in anonymously at a station in Spitalfields. But listen, Watson, return to sender. Third watchdog has barked. That is all." I frowned. "It sounds like nonsense." "Precisely, which means it is likely a code. The phrase return to sender implies a message gone astray, or a betrayal of some kind. Third watchdog has barked suggests a sequence, a progression." "You believe it to be connected to our case?" "I would stake my reputation upon it. Consider the timing, just after our inquiries into Larch, just as we begin unearthing the buried threads. And the term watchdog, how else would one refer to a constable in cryptic speech?" He rose and crossed to his desk, retrieving a leather-bound notebook filled with cipher keys and past encrypted correspondences. "The phrasing is not commercial. This is not underworld slang, but military." Or paramilitary. Holmes began comparing the phrase to a series of markings he had encountered once during a campaign of espionage some years prior. His fingers moved deftly across the paper, translating not through mathematics, but through inference. "A signal to proceed," he said at last. "3 officers have been compromised, silenced perhaps. The third has now barked, meaning he has drawn attention. That would be Miles." "And the sender?" Holmes tapped the paper. "Not an ally, Watson. A warning or a threat. Either way, someone is keeping pace with us, and they know we are watching." The morning following the mysterious telegram, I was dispatched by Holmes to make quiet inquiries at Scotland Yard, a task which, by virtue of my prior associations with several former military men in the force, I was not unfit to undertake. Though Holmes rarely entrusted me with such responsibilities, on this occasion he believed that a familiar face, untainted by direct association with the inquiry, might secure confidences where official requests would not. It was in the lower records division, beneath stacks of archived disciplinary files and routine memoranda, that I chanced upon an officer by the name of Dunnett, a former army medic turned constable. Over the course of a cautious and roundabout conversation, Dunnett let slip a troubling rumour that Constable Miles had, in the weeks preceding the incident, expressed concerns over the fate of seized narcotics, namely, opium held in police storage. He thought it was going missing in dribs and drabs, Dunnett said in a low voice. Mentioned it to his sergeant, and then again to someone higher up, but was told not to meddle in matters outside his rank. And did he? I asked. Dunnett hesitated. He didn't let it drop. He started keeping his own records, quiet-like. I saw him with a notebook one evening, cross-referencing entries in the seizure logs. Not a bad sort, Miles. Took his badge seriously. The implications chilled me. If Miles had stumbled upon a scheme to siphon off confiscated narcotics, and if those implicated were of higher authority, perhaps even within his own division, then his incapacitation might have been more than coincidence. When I returned to Baker Street and relayed the exchange to Holmes, he merely nodded, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. As I suspected, he murmured, "There is a rot, Watson, and Miles may have been on the cusp of exposing it. A crime against the Crown is one thing, a crime from within its own watchman. Now that is a darkness most would rather bury." That very afternoon, as if summoned by the very threads Holmes had begun to untangle, a new name emerged from the mire. Miss Eleanor Vexley, a schoolteacher and social activist whose writings on the structural decay of law enforcement had earned her admiration from some and the quiet enmity of others. Her pamphlet, Justice in Uniform, a call for reform, had circulated through the East End a month prior, decrying corruption among local officials and naming no names, yet implying a breadth of misconduct too systemic to ignore. It was Holmes himself who, in the course of examining newspaper clippings and public grievances, unearthed her connection to the case. "She has made herself a thorn in the side of the constabulary," he said, gesturing to a highlighted section of an editorial. "And from what I gather, she is no mere pamphleteer. She has evidence, or believes she does." We arranged for a discreet meeting at a local coffeehouse in Stepney. Miss Vexley arrived precisely on time. Tall, composed, her dark eyes fixed upon Holmes with neither fear nor deference. "I assume," she said at once, "this is about Alfred Miles." "You knew him?" I asked. "Well enough," she replied. "He came to one of our meetings 3 weeks ago. Quiet man. He didn't speak, but he listened, intently. I assumed he was there to monitor us." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And you no longer believe that?" "Number not after what happened to him. He was afraid of something. He lingered after the meeting. Asked me what I knew about a man named Kellerman. I told him Kellerman had been mentioned before. Whispers of payoffs and falsified records." Holmes leaned forward. "And you?" She shook her head. "I know what I've heard, Mr. Holmes, but I've no documents, only questions, and perhaps a target painted on my back." Her final words did not strike me as melodramatic. Holmes, too, seemed to register the gravity of her position. "Keep your doors locked, Miss Vexley," he said evenly. "And if anyone shadows you in the street, do not be brave. Be wary. The hounds have begun to stir. It was scarcely 24 hours after our meeting with Miss Vexley that a terse message arrived at Baker Street, scrawled in an anxious hand and delivered by a neighbourhood boy. Holmes read it twice, then rose without a word and beckoned for me to follow. We arrived at Miss Vexley's lodgings to find her visibly shaken, though far from helpless. Her parlour had been upturned, the desk drawers emptied, cabinets forced, and papers scattered across the floor in disarray. And yet, curiously, nothing of value appeared to have been stolen. "I went out for no more than an hour," she explained, "to the baker on Northcote Street. When I returned, the front lock had been forced and the entire place ransacked. But my jewellery, my coins, untouched." Holmes was already moving through the room with an almost imperceptible intensity, his gaze sweeping over the mess with methodical calculation. He paused by the desk, lifting a single envelope from the hearth rug. Its contents had been removed. "This was no common burglary," he murmured. "They sought something specific, and when they did not find it, they made a spectacle of the search to imply chaos." He turned to Miss Vexley. "Was there anything of interest you kept here? Records, correspondence, notes from Miles, perhaps?" She hesitated. "Only scraps. Names he'd mentioned to me in confidence, Kellerman among them. But I kept those in my handbag, not here." Holmes's eyes flicked to the window, where a faint scuff marked the sill. "You are being watched, Miss Vexley, and I do not speak metaphorically. There were 2 men posted across the street. They scattered the moment our cab drew near." She paled slightly, but stood her ground. "Then I was right to fear." "Fear," said Holmes, "is an appropriate sentiment. But more importantly, it confirms that you are no longer an observer. You are now part of the game, and those who play this game do not bluff for long. We were summoned with great urgency the following morning by Inspector Rudge, whose message bore no pleasantries and arrived sealed with a red wax stamp. Holmes read it, tossed the paper aside, and had his coat on before I could rise from my chair. At the station infirmary, the air was thick with tension. Miles lay unconscious once again, not in sleep, but in a state of unnatural stupor, his pulse erratic and his breathing shallow. The attending physician met us at the door. "No wounds," he explained grimly, "but something has been administered, something powerful. We've begun treatment, but the nature of the toxin is uncommon." Holmes moved directly to the bedside, his face inscrutable. He examined the rim of the water glass on the stand, the edge of the bedding, even the knot in Miles's blanket. At length, he turned to the physician. "There was a visitor." "Yes, just after dawn. Claimed to be his cousin. Left no name. We were short-staffed. No one thought to question it." Holmes nodded once, curtly, and removed from his coat a small phial. With the utmost care, he dabbed a cloth across Miles's lips and held the fabric to his nose. The faintest frown appeared on his face. "Belladonna," he said at last. "Not in its raw form, but tinctured and masked by a sweetening agent. Crude, but effective." "A deliberate poisoning?" I asked. "Most assuredly. And administered in haste, which tells us 2 things. That the perpetrator had limited access and that they feared what Miles might yet remember." Holmes turned to Rudge. "Post guards on this man. No visitors, not even clergy. From this point forward, Miles is a marked man." And then, more softly to me, "The hand that struck here is the same hand that loosed the hounds upon Eleanor Vexley. This is no longer a matter of stolen papers, Watson. We have stepped fully into a conspiracy, and it is beginning to show its teeth." It was late in the evening when Holmes summoned both Inspector Rudge and myself to Baker Street. The sitting room bore the usual signs of Holmes' preparations. Papers scattered like a battlefield, the remnants of a hasty meal untouched, and a chalk outline upon the wall that appeared to chart the comings and goings of half the constabulary. "The time has come," Holmes said without preamble. "They have grown too bold. A trap, then, and a visible one." He proceeded to outline his plan with characteristic precision. A public notice would be leaked through unofficial channels, suggesting that a second cache of government documents, salvaged from the original breach, was to be discreetly transported across London the following night, under light protection, and through an alternate route known only to a few. "In truth," he added with a glint of amusement, "there are no documents at all, but word shall reach the ears it must. Those involved in the original theft cannot afford another failure, not if they fear what we might yet uncover. They will act, and in haste." "But is it not rather dangerous," I interjected, "to place the bait so openly?" Holmes turned to me with an expression both amused and strangely serene. "Not if one ensures that the bait is an illusion, Watson. What they shall attempt to seize is a decoy, manned, of course, by men of our choosing." Rudge nodded grimly. "We'll outfit a carriage and post 2 plainclothesmen at the rear." "What time?" "Midnight," Holmes replied. "Let the darkness shield the play." "And you?" I asked. He paused briefly. "I shall be nearby, but not as myself. Tonight, I become part of the city's background, a forgotten man of no consequence, yet privy to all." The wheels of the trap were set in motion, and though I had long since ceased to question Holmes's confidence in such matters, I confess I felt an uneasy thrill in the knowledge that we were inviting the hand of a criminal syndicate to reveal itself under the cover of night. There were few things that astonished me any more about my friend Sherlock Holmes, but his talent for disguise retained the power to unsettle. It was shortly after 10 o'clock when he emerged from his bedroom not as the man I knew, but as a shabby lamplighter, bent slightly with age, his face lined and stained with a mockery of soot. His gait had changed, his voice adopted a Cockney drawl so convincing that, had I not witnessed the transformation, I might not have recognised him myself. "You and Rudge will remain near the corner of Pember Lane," he instructed. "From there you will have a full view of the decoy's path. I shall be posted across from the alley's entrance, tending to a lantern that does not require tending." Rudge grunted approval. "If anyone so much as breathes in the wrong direction, we'll have 'em." Holmes gave a curt nod. "There will be a moment, subtle but certain. Watch for movement in the shadow, not at the scene. The man behind this will not act with his own hands unless he has no choice." We arrived at the designated location just shy of midnight. The false carriage, outfitted to resemble a government transport, passed slowly down the narrow lane. Its progress was unremarkable, its guards plain-clothed and steady-eyed. There was no disturbance, at first. Then I saw it, a shift in the darkness, a sliver of motion no wider than a man's shoulder where the alley wall met the warehouse stack. Holmes, still in the guise of the lamplighter, had frozen, his back to the alley, his head slightly turned. He was waiting, calculating, and then, like a striking serpent, a figure darted forward from the shadows, silent, swift, and armed with a blunt object aimed at the rear officer's neck. He never made it. Holmes moved before the blow could land, sweeping the attacker's legs with one motion and pinning him against the stonework with astonishing force. The man struggled, then slumped, breathless and stunned. "Sergeant Horace Larch," Holmes said coldly. "I rather thought you'd be here." In the moments that followed Holmes's unmasking of the would-be assailant, a silence settled over the alley that was almost reverent in its stillness. Rudge and his men had surged forward with efficiency, binding the man's wrists with practiced hands. A whistle pierced the air. Ours, not the enemy's. And within minutes, the false transport and its occupants had vanished from view, as if they had never been there at all. "Name?" barked Rudge, though I suspect he, like the rest of us, already knew the answer. The prisoner, a lean figure with cropped hair and an expression of blank fury, said nothing. But Holmes did not wait for his cooperation. Instead, he reached into the folds of the man's coat and withdrew a pocketbook. Plain, worn, but secured with a small brass clasp. "Do you recognize the stitching, Watson?" he said calmly. "Issued by the department, though curiously absent from his current assignment." The initials inside read, "H. L. Rudge," exhaled sharply. "Larch." There was no denial, no struggle. The man stood as still as stone, his eyes unreadable in the lamplight. Holmes turned to me. "You'll recall, Watson, that Sergeant Larch made a point of disparaging Miles, dismissing his character with excessive ease. That was not professional rivalry. It was preemptive discreditation, meant to lay the groundwork for a narrative in which Miles could be discarded without scrutiny. The pieces were aligning in my mind as well. And the break-in at Miss Vexley's home? A last attempt to recover or suppress any evidence she might possess, or perhaps to frighten her into silence. He underestimated her resolve. At that moment, one of Rudge's constables approached with a small tin cylinder recovered from the attacker's coat pocket. Holmes took it, uncapped it, and dabbed the contents onto his glove. He sniffed once and nodded. Belladonna tincture. Just as I suspected. The very same used on Miles. It was all but settled. Larch had revealed his hand, and the trap Holmes had so carefully laid had ensnared him with ruthless precision. But as ever, the truth ran deeper still, and Holmes was not yet finished. Holmes turned toward the bound man, who now sat upon a crate under armed guard. The expression upon Larch's face remained unmoved. One might have mistaken him for a man awaiting a train rather than a formal charge. "You have been clever," Holmes began, his tone devoid of gloating. "But cleverness alone is not a substitute for caution. You understood that Miles had grown suspicious of the irregularities in your division, namely, the unexplained vanishing of certain opium seizures. You also knew that, should he pursue the matter, your arrangement with Mr. Kellerman would come to light." That name caused a flicker in Larch's countenance, barely perceptible, but to Holmes, enough. Yes, Kellerman, the warehouse supervisor who claimed ignorance of his own inventory. A man paid not to protect, but to facilitate. And when the theft occurred, it was no random raid, but a premeditated operation disguised as an internal failure. He stepped closer. "You drugged Miles with belladonna, a simple but effective compound, delivered by means we have yet to uncover, but which I suspect was concealed in a pipe stem or refreshment. Once unconscious, you planted the narrative of negligence, ensured the keyring vanished, and signalled your accomplices with the same whistled tune Miles dimly recalled in his final conscious moment. I stood motionless as the web unfolded." Holmes continued. "But then there was a complication. Miles did not die. Worse, he remembered fragments. And worse still, he had begun speaking to people. Vexley, Dunnett, even us. You made another attempt on his life. Failed again." Larch looked up, his voice finally rasping out. "You'll never prove it." Holmes raised a brow. "We shall not need to. The belladonna in your coat, the notebook with marked transfers, your own steps into that alley, all will suffice. But the true proof lies elsewhere." He turned to Rudge. "Kellerman will talk. He lacks your resolve." At this, Larch's shoulders dropped imperceptibly. Holmes straightened. The play is over, and even the most cunning fox cannot outrun the hounds forever. The events of the night had rendered Holmes uncommonly silent, and it was not until the following morning, back in the familiar sanctuary of Baker Street, that he delivered the full extent of his deductions, now sharpened into certainty by Larch's arrest and Kellerman's subsequent confession. It began, as most such things do, Holmes said, with greed. Larch and Kellerman operated a quiet but highly profitable venture, systematically extracting narcotics from the police seizure vault and introducing them into illicit circulation through intermediaries in the East End. The goods were disguised as destroyed, the books forged, and questions, if any were raised, were lost amidst bureaucratic indifference. Miles, I interjected, had seen too much. Indeed, more than he realized at first. He began to cross-reference the entry logs with his own observations. The numbers would not match. So he approached Larch, believing foolishly that a superior officer would share his concerns. Holmes steepled his fingers. Larch, of course, knew then that the young constable posed a threat. Rather than remove him immediately, he chose the more elegant solution: discredit him publicly. And thus came the staged theft. The warehouse, I said slowly, was never random. Number It was Kellerman's facility, chosen for its proximity and plausible access. Miles was placed on the late shift with calculated intent. Larch lured him into complacency, drugged him, removed the documents, and made certain that Miles would be discovered in disgrace. But when Miles survived, when he began to piece together fragments of memory, it became a race. Holmes nodded. Yes. The attack in the infirmary, the break-in at Miss Vexley's, all desperate moves from men who knew the walls were closing in. They believed themselves clever, and in truth, they were not fools. But they lacked imagination. Criminality, Watson, often mistakes audacity for brilliance. He rose, stretched his arms, and reached for the violin resting beside the hearth. In the end, the pattern was crude, but it required someone willing to listen to the smallest contradiction, to notice a bruised bootlace or a wax trail others deemed irrelevant. That, he said with a rare smile, was our advantage. Holmes turned his attention to the peculiar state in which Miles had been found, lying prone near the warehouse, uninjured yet unrousable. It had, at the time, baffled all involved and had lent credence to the theory of mere negligence. The truth, Holmes explained, was more precise and more sinister. He held aloft a narrow wooden stem, the remnants of a pipe found among the personal effects returned to Larch's quarters. The bowl had been hollowed, and within it was a residue Holmes had already submitted for chemical analysis. A delivery mechanism, he said. Simple, discreet, and effective. Larch offered Miles a smoke that evening, a gesture of camaraderie. Within the stem was a concentrated dose of belladonna mixed with laudanum and camphor, enough to render a man unconscious within moments, but with symptoms that mimicked fatigue or alcohol-induced stupor. I shuddered at the thought. And the bruising? Delivered post-incapacitation, Holmes replied grimly. To ensure the story held, evidence of a fall perhaps. It was orchestrated to discredit, not to kill. That came later, when Miles showed signs of recovering his memory. He paused. The phrase sleeping policeman thus acquired a cruel double meaning. It was not merely the public's derision. It was a calculated insult, delivered by those who believed themselves untouchable. Holmes concluded with the telegram, the cryptic message that had first signalled to us the presence of a hidden hand orchestrating events. Return to sender. Third watchdog has barked. It was not a warning to us, Watson. It was a signal to the others involved, confirmation that Miles had spoken and that action was required. He tapped the page lightly. The watchdogs refer to honest officers, men like Miles, who had either resisted or uncovered the conspiracy. The first two, I suspect, were transferred, silenced, or otherwise neutralized. Miles, the third, had barked. He had sounded an alarm. "And return to sender?" I asked. "A directive," Holmes replied, "that whoever dealt with the issue was to report back." Larch evidently assumed that role. "But by sending the message," I said, "they revealed themselves." Holmes smiled faintly. "Criminals speak in riddles, Watson, but their codes betray them all the same. They cannot resist the illusion of superiority. It is always their undoing." He turned away then, his voice growing distant. "There is a great irony in that, for while they thought themselves the hunters, it was we, the true watchdogs, who were listening all along." The morning after Sergeant Larch's arrest found Holmes in uncharacteristically contemplative mood. The fire burned low in our grate, and a thin fog curled past the window panes, as though reluctant to leave us to our own thoughts. We sat in silence for some time, he with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and I with notebook in hand, awaiting the inevitable unspooling of his conclusions. "At times," Holmes said at last, "a case does not present itself in fragments, but as a whole, a dark mass obscured by smoke and misdirection. And it becomes our task not to reconstruct it piece by piece, but to wipe away the soot and see what lies beneath." I said nothing, for I knew he was not speaking for my benefit alone. He rose and paced the room slowly. "This was never merely a theft," he continued. "It was a coordinated effort to disguise internal corruption under the veil of incompetence. The perpetrators gambled that no one would look closely at what was lost, only at who failed to prevent its loss." He paused by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. But Miles was not the fool they imagined. He was methodical, observant, and, crucially, honourable. His inquiries into the missing opium shipments brought him within striking distance of the truth, too close for Larch's comfort. "And the attack on him?" I asked. "A performance," Holmes replied, "designed to appear accidental or self-inflicted. When that failed, they attempted a second act, this time more direct." He turned back to face me. "But once we identified the trail, faint though it was, it led us inevitably to the culprits. A warehouse chosen not at random, a key ring that vanished without trace, a break-in that disturbed nothing of value. Each misstep a thread. And you wove them into a net," I said. He inclined his head slightly. "No, Watson, they wove it themselves. I merely gave it shape." Holmes's mind, once fully engaged, pursued the truth with such relentless clarity that the events of the past week now fell into place with startling precision. Of all the subtle details, it was one, perhaps the most easily dismissed, that he now seized upon with particular satisfaction. "The footprints outside the warehouse," he said, resuming his seat and placing his fingertips together, "were among the earliest indicators that something was amiss. The assumption made by the police was that they belonged to Constable Miles, that, in his supposed dereliction, he had paced nervously or staggered aimlessly. But this was inconsistent with the man's conduct and his condition." He gestured toward the notebook in which I had jotted observations. "Do you recall, Watson, the nature of those impressions?" "I remember they were shallow," I replied, "and oddly spaced." "Precisely. They bore a slight asymmetry, more weight on the left heel and a dragging of the right foot. At the time I said nothing, but when I visited Mr. Kellerman at the warehouse, I observed that he moved with a distinct but subtle limp, favouring his left side. "The same pattern," I murmured. "Indeed." Now Kellerman made no mention of having entered the warehouse after the break-in, yet the prints corresponded precisely to his gait. Therefore he had been present, and recently. That, coupled with his feigned ignorance of the building's inventory, led me to suspect his deeper involvement. Holmes stood and fetched a folded document from the mantel. Further, I confirmed through Rudge that Kellerman's medical history included a workplace injury 3 years ago, fractured fibula, left leg, resulting in permanent gait alteration. And the constables had not noticed. None were trained observers, Holmes said with a shrug. They saw boots in the dust. I saw the signature of a man who lied. It was, as always, the simplest of details, a limp, a footprint that turned the key in the lock. I marvelled once again at Holmes's faculty for perceiving the invisible in what all others deemed mundane. Holmes now turned his attention to what he termed one of the silent witnesses of the crime, a detail so trivial in appearance that only the most scrupulous of minds would have accorded it weight. "You recall, Watson," he said, "the faint smears of red wax upon the floorboards of the warehouse office. Most assumed it a remnant from broken seals on shipping crates or packaging, but I noted its composition, thicker, more lustrous, and of a distinct hue. Not commercial wax at all, but forensic sealing compound, issued exclusively to police inventory units." I raised my eyebrows. "Then it must have come from within the force." "Precisely," Holmes nodded. "More than that, it had been recently used." I later confirmed with Inspector Rudge that a forged police seal had gone missing from the Central Records Office 6 weeks prior, and that the loss had been reported and dismissed as a clerical misplacement. He withdrew a small envelope from his desk drawer, within which lay a photograph of the recovered seal, its impression bearing the correct insignia, but with a slight misalignment of the crown emblem, as if cast hastily by an unskilled hand. "This seal," Holmes said, "was used to affix the forged documents placed in the warehouse prior to the incident. It gave the appearance of official custody and was meant to delay suspicion. More importantly, it was applied to empty or irrelevant files, allowing the genuine records, those relating to narcotic seizures and transfer logs, to be quietly removed and sold." "And who had access to such tools?" I asked. "Kellerman," he replied, "but under Larch's instruction. It was Larch who obtained the forged seal, who falsified the internal transfer forms, and who ensured that the remaining papers bore the proper signature of authority." Holmes glanced toward the fireplace, his expression unreadable. "They took extraordinary measures to legitimize their theft. But in so doing, they left behind traces only visible to a man who troubles himself with the texture of wax." From the very outset of our inquiry, I had noted Holmes's peculiar attention to odours, pausing to inhale the lining of Miles's coat, the rim of a teacup, and even the hems of curtains in the infirmary. At the time, I thought it a quirk of his method. It was only later that I understood the significance. "There is a scent," Holmes now said, "which lingers long after its work is done. A mingling of laudanum and belladonna, faint but unmistakable. The two, when combined in specific measure, produce an effect not unlike sleep, though far more dangerous in its design." He reached into the drawer and produced a cork-stoppered vial. This was recovered from Larch's personal effects. Its contents, when analysed, matched precisely the compound found on Miles's lips and garments. Belladonna tincture, sweetened with honeyed spirits to disguise its bitterness. Common among certain foreign apothecaries, but illegal in any regulated medicinal setting. I frowned. And yet no odour was strong enough to alert the others? Holmes smiled faintly. That is the deception. The scent is designed to dissipate swiftly, its potency hidden within the mechanism of delivery. But to the trained nose, it leaves behind a signature. Once I had identified it on Miles's clothing, I searched for the same trace elsewhere. Larch's overcoat bore it. So did the hem of his left glove. He paused a moment before continuing. Even more damning was the presence of the same aroma in Kellerman's office desk drawer, suggesting not merely knowledge, but complicity. And the mixture's origin? I asked. A chemist's shop in Wapping, one that has since shuttered its doors. But its logbook remains, and in it, the signature of H. Larch, scribbled under the false pretense of veterinary tonic. Holmes folded his arms. It is a small scent, Watson, but it led to the largest truth. In such matters, justice is often not blind but slow to sniff. We, however, followed the trail to its end. In the days that followed Larch's arrest and Kellerman's confession, the truth spread swiftly through the ranks of the constabulary, and, in time, through the pages of the press. Though neither Holmes nor I placed any stock in public accolades, it was not without a certain grim satisfaction that we read the Strand Gazette's morning headline, "The Sleeping Policeman Awakens, Holmes Unravels Police Conspiracy." Constable Alfred Miles was formally cleared of all charges. The accusations of dereliction were withdrawn in full, and a statement from the Commissioner himself declared the young officer's record restored beyond question. Holmes and I visited Miles at the infirmary shortly before his discharge. Though still pale, he had regained his composure and met Holmes's gaze with an expression of quiet awe. "I thought I was losing my mind," he said. "The things I remembered, they didn't make sense." "They made perfect sense," Holmes replied calmly. "You simply lack the evidence to prove them. That is where others failed you. But you remained steadfast, and that is the mark of a true guardian of the law." Miles said nothing in reply, but his expression conveyed more than words. Miss Eleanor Vexley, too, was vindicated. With her name cleared of subversive intent, she returned to her work with renewed purpose. Though under Holmes's gentle suggestion, she agreed to relocate her residence to a less conspicuous part of the city. "I doubt you'll remain undisturbed," he said to her, "but your voice now holds weight. Use it wisely." She nodded, eyes shining with something between gratitude and defiance. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I shall." As for Holmes, he greeted the wave of praise with his usual indifference. Letters arrived from editors, dignitaries, and even a Parliament man. Most went unanswered. "It is curious," he remarked one afternoon, "how little weight praise holds when one knows the truth would not have emerged without effort no one else cared to make." The case, though resolved with precision, left me with an unease that did not subside easily. I found myself pondering not the details of the crime, but the rot it revealed. Quiet, insidious, and bred not from desperation, but from opportunity. That men sworn to uphold justice could so easily be tempted into betrayal was not, perhaps, novel. And yet, to witness it unfold within our own police ranks, among those entrusted with protection, order, and the rule of law, struck me with a melancholy that even our victory could not dispel. I thought of Miles, earnest and diligent, brought to the edge of ruin by the very hands that should have lifted him. I thought of Vexley, accused of sedition for the mere act of speaking truth. And I thought, above all, of those who would have never been discovered had it not been for the tenacity of one man who refused to see shadows where others saw nothing. It is not the presence of evil that unnerves me most, but the comfort with which it is permitted to settle into familiar uniforms. That evening, I relayed my thoughts aloud as we shared a quiet supper. Holmes, who had listened in silence, now set down his fork and turned to me with an expression of almost weary amusement. "You speak, Watson, as though corruption were a surprise. It is not. It is as natural to human enterprise as rust to iron." "But surely," I said, "not in institutions founded to preserve justice." He raised an eyebrow. "Founded for justice, yes, but staffed by men, and men are by nature fallible. Power is a curious narcotic. It invites blindness in some and breeds arrogance in others." He poured himself a measure of brandy and swirled it thoughtfully. "I do not despair at these discoveries," he continued, "only at how seldom others care to look for them." I said nothing, for there was little to add. Holmes leaned back in his chair and fixed me with a look of quiet irony. "Even those paid to watch," he said, "must at times be watched more closely still." In the days that followed, the world returned, as it always did, to its habitual rhythm. Cases resumed. The clatter of carriages echoed once more in Baker Street, and Holmes, untouched by the storm he had weathered, resumed his strange domestic rituals with an air of serene detachment. He spoke little of the case thereafter, save for a fleeting mention when I inquired whether he had heard again from the Commissioner. "No," he said, tuning his violin, "and I would prefer it remain so." I watched him for a moment in silence, noting the slight furrow in his brow as he adjusted the string. Then came the bow, long, slow, and deliberate across the strings. A low note filled the room, sombre yet composed. To the outside world, he was the triumphant sleuth. But I, who knew him best, recognized something more beneath the surface, a mind already turning elsewhere, to another puzzle, another ghost in the fog. "Do you ever tire of it?" I asked suddenly. "This endless procession of shadows?" He did not look up. "No, Watson," he said quietly, "but I grow weary of those who choose not to see them." And with that, the music rose once more. That evening, as we sat once more within the quiet of our Baker Street lodgings, the fire crackling low and the scent of tobacco curling in the air, I turned to Holmes. "You know," I said, "what troubles me most is how easily it all might have gone unnoticed. Miles could have been dismissed, Eleanor discredited, and the rot left to fester." Holmes didn't look up from his violin, which he was restringing with the same care he afforded a loaded revolver. "Society, Watson," he murmured, "is not undone by great villains, but by subtle betrayals. The truly dangerous crimes are rarely loud. They slip through the cracks, carried out by men who smile in daylight and poison by night." He paused, twisting a peg with delicate precision. "Justice," he added, "relies less on the strength of its systems than on the vigilance of its witnesses. And sometimes, even the watchers must be watched. Now tell me, dear reader, or should I say fellow detective, what do you think was the criminal's greatest mistake? Was it Larch's overconfidence, Kellerman's limp, or something more subtle that Holmes never said aloud? Share your deductions in the comments. We'd love to hear how you would have solved it. If you enjoyed this case from the archives of Baker Street, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries, each one a test of reason, observation, and the human soul. Comment your theory, share the story with a fellow mystery lover, and join us next time for another tale where shadows walk and logic shines. Until then, watch closely.